One of the people that Maslow inspired was Carl Rogers, who created person-centered therapy based on Maslow's humanistic approach to psychology. Rogers' form of psychotherapy is still popular today and still generating a tremendous amount of research. In fact, some of you who will go on to study clinical psychology may find that Rogers' ideas are the ones that you align with best, and you may use this type of therapy in your practice. Rogers was born in Illinois in 1903, and like Maslow, he also experienced loneliness, isolation as a child. His parents were religious, controlling, and he believed that they favored one of his brothers over him. Like Maslow, he escaped these feelings of loneliness by reading, by learning as much as he could about the world. When his family moved to a small farm, he was introduced to the agricultural industry. He learned about some of the experiments that farmers were conducting at the time. He was fascinated by these experiments and would go on to study the scientific method in college. His parents wanted him to become a minister, so he studied theology as an undergraduate. After traveling to China and spending several months there, he began to change his outlook on life. He began to realize that his parents had essentially controlled his ideas, his beliefs, his behaviors, his entire life. He began to separate himself from his parents and explore the world from his own perspective. He became interested in psychology and earned his PhD from Columbia University in 1931. Throughout his career, he worked tirelessly to bring clinical psychology into the mainstream. He was a clinician. He promoted the use of the term client instead of patient. He was also a teacher and a researcher. He gained experience in clinical psychology by testing and assessing children who had experiences with law enforcement. He himself underwent psychotherapy and was able to learn how to better love himself and better love other people. Rogers agreed with Maslow's concept of self-actualization, but Rogers had his own ideas about how this happens. He said that humans are motivated by what he called an actualizing tendency, the innate desire to develop, maintain, and then enhance the self. He said that this tendency includes all of our needs, both physiological and psychological. This process of actualizing is guided by the organismic valuing process. This process, this judgment process, involves judging our experiences in terms of whether they can help us grow or not. The experiences that we think will help us are assigned a positive value. It doesn't mean that they will help us, it just means we think they will. For example, many of you are in college today because you think this learning experience will help you actualize, will help you reach your fullest potential. So you assign going to college a positive value. As infants develop and their experience of the world broadens, their new experiences become the foundation, the standard against which they judge themselves, the environment, their behaviors, their attitudes, everything about themselves is based on these experiences. Through these early experiences, they develop their self-concept. There is a part of these experiences, there's a theme in their life experiences that begins to emerge and dominate that person's way of thinking. He called this the self. There are three parts to the self-concept according to Rogers. I have those three parts at the bottom of the screen. The ideal self is the person we would like to become, our goals for the future. The self-image is how we currently see ourselves, how we perceive who we are today. Self-worth has to do with what we think about ourselves, the value we place on who we are today. These three aspects are part of the self-concept. The self-concept emerges in childhood as kids begin to experience their world. As the self-concept emerges, children develop a need for what he called positive regard. This is basically the need for love, affection, approval, esteem from others. Their parents are responsible for either fulfilling or hindering the satisfaction of this need for positive regard. Parents can satisfy this need conditionally or unconditionally. Conditional positive regard is provided when a child meets the parent's expectations, and only when the child meets the parent's expectations. If the child does something undesirable, no positive regard is provided. It's only when the child behaves as they should that they receive love and affection. Unconditional positive regard is provided all the time, regardless of how the child acts. Even when the child is being a little stinker, the parents still show love and affection to that child. If a child's parents provide both conditional and unconditional positive regard, the child will eventually learn how to create this positive regard from within themselves. They learn how to satisfy that need on their own. They don't need other people to make them feel good about themselves. He called this positive self-regard, positive regard that comes from the self. As children come to learn that they have to behave in order to receive positive regard, as they learn this, they develop perceptions of self-worth, what he called conditions of worth. These are the beliefs about whether they are worthy or not. As you can imagine, when parents provide conditional positive regard, this leads children to value themselves only in certain situations. When parents provide unconditional positive regard, children learn to love themselves regardless of their mistakes and errors. When parents don't provide positive regard, when parents disapprove of a child's behavior, the child perceives that as disapproval of their self. It makes them feel bad about themselves because they think their parents are upset with their self, not their behaviors. Children don't recognize that difference just yet. Too much disapproval, of course, then leads them to stop actualizing altogether. They essentially give up and just rely on everyone else to satisfy this need for positive regard. According to Rogers, our psychological health depends on the alignment, the congruence between our self-concept and our actual experience of the world. Our reality then depends on our perception of the world, which may or may not be accurate. People who rely too much on other people to make them feel good about themselves develop what he called incongruence, which can lead to things like low self-esteem, constant anxiety, and defensiveness. According to Rogers, the ultimate goal in life is to become what he called a fully functioning person. Maslow referred to this as self-actualization. He called these people self-actualizers. Rogers used a different term to describe essentially the same thing. Fully functioning individuals continuously test, grow, strive, and use all of their knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to live their lives. As people become more fully functioning, they rely more on free will and choice in creating themselves and maintaining that image and improving that image of themselves. Childhood experiences, yes, do play a role and do impact personality development, but according to Rogers, it's those experiences later on in life that have the greatest influence. Here are Rogers' criteria for becoming a fully functioning person. In the reflection exercise, I ask you to compare this list to Maslow's list. You'll see some of the same ideas on both lists. Rogers proposed that fully functioning individuals are hyper aware of their environment. They appreciate new ideas, new experiences. They trust themselves. They make choices without regard for the superficial pressures of society and from others. They're creative, they're spontaneous, and they have a continuous need to grow and become a better version of themselves. This list is a shorter list. There are things on Maslow's list that are not on this list. I encourage you to compare the two and see which list fits with your ideas about a self-actualized, a fully functioning individual. Rogers did not rely on experiments or psychological tests to collect the information he used to develop his theory. He did, however, use empirical research from other theorists to confirm, validate, expand on his own ideas. So his data was not collected through experiments, but he valued experiments and used others' results to help him formulate his own ideas. Instead, Rogers relied on his experiences with his own clients. He created person-centered therapy based on his experiences. This type of therapy is based on the idea that the client should be responsible for driving the change process, the development process. The therapist is only there to guide, assist, facilitate. They are not in control of the process. The client is. A therapist who uses this approach wants to make sure that they check two boxes. One, focus on the client's subjective experience of the world. How do they see things? What do they think? How do they feel? What is life like from their perspective? That's important because our perceptions of reality impact our psychological health. Number two, make sure that you provide unconditional, positive regard for your clients. Basically, what this means is every client, regardless of who they are, what they've done, every client has value. Every client is worthy of living in this world. If you provide that unconditional respect, according to Rogers, you create the type of environment where that person can explore the different parts of their authentic self, identify those parts that they'd like to amplify, and develop to meet their full potential. Rogers also applied his person-centered therapy in group situations. He called groups that underwent client-centered therapy together, he called these groups encounter groups because they encounter new ideas from discussing their own thoughts and feelings with other people. Within an encounter group, there are 8 to 15 different people, often sitting in a circle facing one another. They meet for many sessions, 20 to 60 when Rogers was in charge. The facilitator of the group helps the group members gain insight from one another as they talk through some of their life experiences, their perceptions, and the facilitator guides them, encourages them to explore some of those ideas, those thoughts, those feelings. As they do this, they share information that is often relevant and useful for other people in the group. One of the things that Rogers did at the time that was revolutionary was he recorded his individual and group therapy sessions. This image on the slide comes from a YouTube video that illustrates his person-centered therapy with an individual by the name of Richie. After recording these therapy sessions, he shared the film with other researchers, and they were ecstatic about this. They used his videos to further study therapy, personality, behavior modification. They looked at things like the words, the behaviors, and the emotions that people expressed. Rogers called these recordings a microscope because he believed they would allow researchers to better understand not only personality, but how it changes over time. Rogers did not create any personality tests of his own, but he, of course, inspired the creation of many. The experiencing scale was created in 1969 to help researchers and clinicians evaluate the words that clients used in therapy. This assessment was a way to standardize the analysis process. Although he didn't create any tests of his own, he did rely heavily on the Q-sort technique, which was developed in 1953 by a man named Stevenson. This technique was originally designed to assess the self-concept, one's perception of who they are. This technique works by presenting clients with a series of statements about the self. They have to sort those statements according to those that they think describe themselves and those that they don't think describe themselves. Most descriptive, least descriptive. Today, the Q-sort technique has evolved into a variety of different tests. I have an example here if you'd like to get a better idea of what this Q-sort technique looked like. Modern research supports some of the assumptions underlying Rogers' theory. However, it appears that his ideas may only be relevant in individualistic cultures. Personality development might occur differently in more collectivistic cultures. It appears also that fully functioning individuals are more open to experiences than those who do not meet his criteria. Children's degree of self-acceptance does depend in part on their parents' degree of self-acceptance. So if a mother has high self-acceptance, her child is more likely to have high self-acceptance. If a mother has low self-acceptance, the child is more likely to have low self-acceptance as well. You might think that receiving so much love and affection, even when you're misbehaving, might cause problems later in life. But in fact, we've found that unconditional love and affection can actually lead children to develop feelings of self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence, self-efficacy. Research also supports his prediction that incongruence between one's self and their perception of the world, this incongruence can lead to emotional problems, low self-esteem, the inability to actualize. And finally, failing to realize our potential, wasting our potential can lead to maladjustment. I'm sure some of you know at least one person in your life who had great potential growing up. Maybe they were the star sports player or they were the smartest kid in the class, but they didn't realize their potential. Those individuals are more likely to suffer from psychological and emotional maladjustment than people who try to actualize the self. Before we end this week's lecture, I'd like to cover the strengths and weaknesses of Rogers' theory. Rogers' ideas influenced clinical and counseling psychology, as well as psychotherapy and the different approaches that psychotherapists used with their clients. Rogers' therapy was used with World War II veterans as they returned home from Europe. Many of these veterans had trouble readjusting to normal American life. His therapy was used to help them make this readjustment. As a result, it became popular and well known as a type of therapy that actually worked. Some of his core concepts are widely accepted by therapists from different orientations. Ideas like the self-concept. The self-concept plays a major role in most therapies we use today. Unfortunately, like any other theory, his suffers from a few disadvantages. He completely disregarded the influence of unconscious forces. The fact that Rogers focused solely on conscious factors leaves out some important information. The fact that he relied on his clients' subjective analysis of their life experiences, of the things that they were feeling and thinking, this reliance is a problem. Any one of those reports could be distorted, incomplete, inaccurate. Although some of his core concepts are widely accepted, some of his core concepts are not. This idea of unconditional positive regard is not something that we see in all cultures. It's not a universal concept. We finished yet another lecture in Theories of Personality. Thank you for sticking with me. Next week, we will cover B.F. Skinner's behavioral approach to the study of personality.